Dune Part 2 has been well received by the general audience and critics alike, so there's no shortage of praise to be found on review sites. But out of interest, I sifted through all the praise to find out what kind of gripes detractors of the film have. I found a few reviews which make some reasonable points about possible problems with the film, but one review particularly stood out to me, and was in certain ways rather strange. The review is extremely hostile towards Dune Part 2, and indeed derisive towards other well-regarded cinema behemoths, like the Lord of the Rings films and Gladiator, bringing them up as examples of films with comparable aspects to Dune Part 2. The review is critical of more or less everything about Dune Part 2, lampooning it on many fronts, but one particular comparison seemed worth commenting on. The review brings up Zack Snyder's Rebel Moon as an example of a film that executes its use of the sci-fi fantasy genre more successfully than the modern Dune films, praising the mythic elements of Rebel Moon, stating the film revives mythic understanding of both mankind's history and fate. The style and pacing are also lauded, with the claim Snyder brought kinetic, erotic excitement that elevated the sci-fi genre, and that the film's images are daring, immediate, and reverberant. The review also acknowledges the self-aware nature and playfulness with the genre in Rebel Moon, the pop culture wit, as the reviewer puts it, which Dune Part 2 apparently lacks. That's surprisingly high praise for Rebel Moon, in the midst of so much vituperation towards it from most other critics. Now, funnily enough, I'm in the minority, because while Rebel Moon was torn apart critically, I actually enjoyed it. Although I do think a lot of the critiques of it are fair. Its issues just didn't really bother me much. I was aware of all the lashings the film was receiving before watching it myself, and then when I finally did watch it, I was rather confused about why people thought it was so bad. I kept waiting for the film to completely fall apart, but that never happened. By the end of the film, I'd had fun. Then I investigated the criticisms of it, and actually thought a lot of them were pretty fair, but still, overall thought the level of vituperation directed towards it was rather excessive. But what of the reviewer's specific claims about Rebel Moon? Well, starting with the claim that the film revives mythic understanding of both mankind's history and fate, I don't think that's a particularly controversial statement. The film was seemingly trying to do something like that. We don't know where the mythic elements are going to be taken in Rebel Moon Part 2, of course. They may end up being more similar to those in Dune. It's hard to predict, because although Snyder has a clear penchant for deconstructive storytelling techniques, he also has an overt reverence for the power of myth. The blending of those two proclivities is something which I think has made his past work so unique and interesting. While I don't think the mythology set up in Rebel Moon is as interesting as that in Dune, its lore is communicated with more clarity, explained in a way that's easier to follow than in Dune. I didn't find Dune Part 2 difficult to follow, but that may be because I knew a sufficient amount about the Dune story before watching the film, so knew the broad strokes of what to expect from it. I do know that other people did find it hard to follow, and I can understand why. As far as the claim in the review that Rebel Moon brought kinetic, erotic excitement that elevated the sci-fi genre, that's more contestable. There's truth in it. It was undeniably faster paced than Dune Part 2, which is clearly very slow a lot of the way through. Whether or not you think Rebel Moon elevates the genre is more subjective. To be honest, overall, I don't really think it does. As for the claim about the daring, immediate and reverberant images, while this is far from Snyder's most visually impressive film, there were certainly some striking and nice-looking shots in it. So reverberant may be fair, daring, maybe in a very small number of cases, although less so than Snyder's past work. I suspect perhaps the director's cut may be more fitting of that description. So, one can agree or disagree with the reviewer's claims about Rebel Moon, but I suppose the claims aren't unreasonable. To me, Rebel Moon is a middling bit of entertainment that doesn't need to be taken too seriously. I liked it, and I'm excited for the sequel, but I must say, I definitely don't agree that Rebel Moon is better than Dune Part 2. I think Rebel Moon is good fun, but Dune Part 2 is good cinema. I do think it's fair to say the Dune films lack the playfulness with genre the reviewer identifies in Rebel Moon, but very intentionally so. The Dune films take their source material and subject matter very seriously, attempting to utilise and elevate their genre. You could argue, rather than commenting on it in any meta way or deconstructing it. Although the Dune story in itself does do these things to a certain extent through its subversive take on myth and heroes. So perhaps the reviewer wanted the techniques of the filmmaking to accentuate those story features of the source material more so, rather than maybe acting like a performance of devotion and reverence to the book from the filmmaker. Perhaps there's an irony in the story of Dune that sets out to critique and undermine religious systems of control and myth-making, being represented on film by someone who seems to have an almost religious reverence to the story itself. There are different arguments that could be had about that. Whatever the case, I opposed the reviewer's antipathy towards Dune Part 2. I'm a fan of it. Various other criticisms he makes in the review, which I haven't gone into here, were actually quite understandable, but others were a bit more out there. Like I said, this review was a bit strange to read, but it's interesting to get a range of different perspectives on films, and so reading one like this is no bad thing. If you want to check out the review yourself, it's linked in the description. Anyway, what do you think? How would you compare Rebel Moon to Dune Part 2? Do you think the reviewer has a point at all? Let me know in the comments below. Leave a like if you enjoyed, and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching, see you next time.